Welcome back. This is Week 1, Lecture 2, The Basic Structures of Christendom. And this lecture sets the stage, so to speak, because here I try to present to you what I consider to be the fundamental aspects and characteristics of the medieval world. I talked about in the last lecture that I view the Reformation as being this transition period from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. And so we need to set up what this myth of Christendom was and what was Christendom to begin with in order to see some of the transitions and transformations. Now, this is somewhat difficult for me because I teach a course in the early Middle Ages and I teach a course in the high and late Middle Ages. So that's like a whole year course condensed into one lecture, basically. I mean, even though the next week's lectures get into the later Middle Ages, which in terms of this course, I will be referring to, as I've already mentioned, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. But here we need to really set the stage because there are fundamental structures that we won't understand what happens and the how it all happens and what changes without understanding some of these structures. So that is what this lecture is about. And we start with the concept of Christendom itself and what was Christendom. Now, here on the slide, which is the second slide, Christendom, I give a definition of Christendom. The definition is a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. Now, that puts it in a different perspective. I mean, the whole concept of Christendom is difficult to kind of grasp because it's not the same as Christianity. The point here is that in the world, in medieval Latin, when we find the term Christianitas, we really need to translate it as Christendom, not as Christianity. Now, this is a minor point, but it could be really important because before the Reformation, Christianity and Christendom were the same thing, and they were the same thing as being Catholic. Catholic simply means universal. The Nicene Creed, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, means one universal church. There's no distinction between Catholicism and Protestantism until we get to the 16th century. I'll be talking about that concept as well. And there's no distinction between Catholicism and Christianity. Now, the only reason I mention that is because I have had students who have asked that question. Okay, Europe was Catholic, but when did it become Christian? Now, that is a problematic formulation based on a serious misunderstanding of what was going on. Okay, so what we need to realize is that until the 16th century, there's Christianity and Catholicism are one and the same. There's no other quote-unquote options except for Eastern Christianity, which I'll be talking about in a second. So that is kind of what we're looking at, okay? And this concept of Christendom, the myth of Christendom, provides the overall structure for making sense of the world. It's not an issue of beliefs or doctrines or morality at all. It is just the assumptions of the reality of the world. Now, for Western Europe, let's say, or for Europe as such, for what was the Western Empire. And that reference to the Western Empire is our point of departure, because to understand Christendom and its development, we have to understand what I refer to as the myth of Rome and the Roman Empire. So we look here to the origins of Christendom in the Roman Empire, the Christianization of the Roman Empire, even though we could argue when does Christendom really emerge, and I'll be getting there as well, but we have to understand some of the background. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire Roman history very quickly. I mean, Rome was supposedly established by 753 BCE by Romulus and Remus. theoretically, a myth. But that's not the kind of myths I'm talking about. When I talk about the myth of Rome, I'm not talking about the myths of Rome, if that makes any sense. This is kind of an overall structure. In 509 BCE, a group of people got together, a group of senators, and overthrew the tyrant and established the Roman Republic, which lasted until, depending on how we date it, 44 BCE or 49 BCE when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or 44 BC when Julius Caesar was assassinated, or in 27 BCE when Augustus established the Principate, which is really the beginning of the Roman Empire as a form of government, which is distinct from empire as the extent of hegemonic rule. So the Roman Empire was an empire far before it was an empire, so to speak. I mean, it was an empire in terms of the extent of its political control, hegemonic control. Hegemony just means kind of authority and control over a region or a territory. But then in the course of the period between 44 BCE and 27 BCE, we have the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And that was a controversial development. Octavian was the nephew of Julius Caesar, and he had to basically fight for his rulership. He served together with two other individuals in what was called the Second Triumvirate. But then he emerges as the single individual sort of in charge of Rome. And he gave power back to the Senate in 27 BCE. Supposedly gave power back to the Senate. And that was a big deal because that was the whole issue. The term imperium, the Latin term imperium, which it means empire, is what we refer to it. In Latin, means command. And so every Roman general had imperium over his troops. So when we look at the concept of empire, we have to see it in terms of command. And what Julius Caesar did was to cross the Rubicon, come into Rome, establish himself as dictator, which was simply part of the Roman Constitution. The Roman Constitution, more of an unwritten constitution. The Republic had two chief executive officers, so to speak, two consuls. The Senate was where the real power was, but then there's also the Assembly, which was the representative body of the people at large, a number of other offices, including the office of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, because religion was very much a part of Rome. Cicero, the staunch opponent of Caesar and the staunch Republican who had himself served as consul, argued that religion was a civic virtue. It was incumbent upon every individual to be religious in that sense. And what did that mean? That meant honoring the gods, your family, and the state. That was what being religious meant. It was paying what was owed to the gods, the state, and your family. And if you were religious, you were considered to be pious, which is the Latin root of our word pious. Now, our word pious, it seems to me, is a word that is not necessarily a positive word. That's for all kinds of reasons. Also historically, in the 17th, 18th century, there was a development of a whole movement called pietism, and it gave the term pious a different connotations than it had in Rome. And in Rome, it just meant it was very much a positive issue. I mean, the highest ideal was to be a pius Romanus, a pious Roman. And Cicero tried to be that. Now, in terms of the dictatorship, the issue was, according to the Constitution, the provisions, when there was chaos and disorder, someone could establish themselves as dictator. And the term dictator simply means one who pronounces, who proclaims, dictates, to restore order. And actually, the General Sulla had done that in 88 BCE. He marched on Rome, restored order, and then returned power to the Senate. What Julius Caesar did was marched on Rome, proclaimed himself dictator, and then did not return power. He claimed that he was going to keep the power of dictator for life. That's why the senators rose up, also with the encouragement of Cicero, and executed him, getting rid of the tyrant. And then what emerged after kind of the chaos thereafter was Octavian, the nephew of Caesar. And when Octavian was able to assert his own individual power and authority, he then, in 27, returned power to the Senate, which Caesar had not done, but Sulla had. So there was a precedence for this. And the Senate was so pleased with that, they gave Octavian the title or the reference. They just ended up hailing him as Augustus. Now, the term Augustus is an adjective. It means fantastic, marvelous, dignified, august. We have that word still in English, even though it's not used very often anymore. So that was what Octavian became. He became Augustus. Octavian Augustus, the great, wonderful leader Augustus, who had given Senate back, or given power back to the Senate. Octavian said, I will simply be the first among equals. I will be the princeps, which is the Latin word for our term prince. The princeps, but I will not have any official role in the government aside from being the first among equals, and I will keep the title of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest. As such, what he did then too was saying, okay, in my role as chief priest, I'm proclaiming Julius Caesar, my uncle, to have become part of the pantheon, proclaiming that Julius Caesar became divine. That's a big deal. This is kind of the beginnings of what scholars have referred to as emperor worship, and what at the time was seen as emperor worship. And it starts with Octavian proclaiming Julius Caesar as divine. Now, that was not that uncommon in the ancient world, i.e., individuals who were so great then became divine. And that was going to be an issue later on, which we'll see shortly, sort of, if I can not allow myself to get sidetracked and talk too much about all of this. So that was a big deal. Then another thing he had said was that Julius Caesar, before he had died, his uncle, had adopted him as his son. And so Octavian took the name of his adopted father, Caesar. So Octavian became known as Caesar Augustus. The title Caesar first was simply a name. I've often kind of joked saying if only Julius Caesar had not been named Julius Caesar but Julius Sack, we would have been talking about sacks. And then Augustus was simply an adjective. It became a title, just as Caesar became a title and an office, so to speak, which I'll be talking about later, shortly. But at first, it's simply a name and then an adjective describing that individual. But it all kind of begins with Octavian, or Caesar Augustus. Because Octavian realized, I have to change how people view things, because there was such a strong Republican sentiment that I have to go about ruling in a different manner. I return power to the Senate, so I don't have any direct power. I have to rule by authority and influence, what Max Weber later would say was charismatic power. And so he did these several different things. One, proclaiming Julius Caesar a god, which then meant he was, as adopted son, he was a son of a god. He also then systematically put his image on Roman coinage. It was not customary whatsoever to put the emperor's image on Roman coins. It happened very rarely, but Augustus makes it a policy. So there was this clear identification of money with the emperor. He also then proclaimed that every city within the empire had to have a particular statue of him displayed in the city square. This was a statue that, again, provided an image of Augustus as this great ruler. These statues could only be produced by officially approved workshops. They all had to be the same. He also wrote a treatise on the glorious deeds of Augustus. He provided, out of his own funds, a lot of money for public games and for food for the populace. And so he's really trying to change public opinion. In many ways, Augustus, we see the first mass propaganda movement. And then he did something else. He hired the poet Virgil. He commissioned the poet Virgil to write a new history of Rome. Virgil did, in his great poem, epic poem, the Aeneid. Now, the Aeneid was a Roman version, so to speak, of Homer. And Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, goes all the way back in terms of, for the Greeks. But what was different is, even though we don't really know for sure who Homer was, or whether there was a single individual named Homer or a couple of people named Homer, what is so amazing about Homer is that Homer was attributed as the author who wrote down these stories about the Trojan War. Homer lived approximately around 800 BCE. Trojan War is dated to approximately 1200 BCE, so 400 years at least after the fact, and stories have been circulating. Virgil created this story from scratch. I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey is kind of the subtext. And Aeneas, Virgil's hero, did appear in the Iliad as a rather minor character. And Virgil makes him the hero. And Aeneas, the story goes, took the Trojan gods. He's a Trojan. And so the Trojans are the heroes here. The Trojans were, after Troy had been destroyed by the Greeks, Aeneas took his father, his aged father, carrying him out of Troy that was burning, and also took the Trojan gods with him, and his fate was to establish a new city in Italy. Aeneas was the son of the Roman goddess Venus, or the Greek goddess Aphrodite. I could go into a whole story. I could spend the whole semester just talking about the Aeneid, actually. It could be really fun to do that, but that's going to be missing the point. I'm already probably way behind schedule here because I'm still dealing with Rome. And we find a couple of prophecies in the Aeneid, in Book 1 and then again in Book 6. And the prophecies are coming from Jupiter, or Zeus. And both prophesy that there will be a new people, the Roman people, and they will rule the world, and they will establish an empire. Aeneas' descendants, which included Romulus and Remus, will establish an eternal empire bounded only by the skies and the ocean. And they name Julius Caesar. And then in Book 6, in the prophecy in Book 6 is retold again, a little bit differently, but the same basic eternal empire, is that there was also Augustus Caesar, who would issue in a golden age of peace, and that the Romans would rule the world in peace and justice as a divinely established empire. Now, that's the Virgil and the Aeneid is so rich, but that is what is really essential here, because this concept of the Roman Empire as this divinely sanctioned and established eternal empire was the myth of Rome, combined with all the other aspects that Augustus established to propagate that, propaganda, to make that kind of stick within the Roman consciousness. And then it was that myth that then became Christianized, because, according to the Gospel of Luke, in the reign of Caesar Augustus, a decree went out that all the world should be taxed. So the birth of Jesus of Nazareth took place during the reign of Caesar Augustus, when there was already this concept of this eternal empire divinely sanctioned. Now, the whole story of the Christianization of the Roman Empire is also a very complex and long one. I'm not going to go into that very much, but Christianity developed as from a rather obscure Jewish sect to eventually becoming the only legal religion of Rome in a relatively short period. I'm trying not to go into all the details and specifics, but if we say, okay, that Jesus, the crucifixion was in approximately, depending on how we date it, 33 or 27 BCE. You say, well, he was 33 when he died, so was it 33? Yeah, but there's dating issues there. But that doesn't really matter. It started spreading, primarily through cities, but not exclusively through cities. It was seen as kind of an opposition movement because it wasn't a religion that supported Rome, even though Jesus supposedly had said, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. His whole crucifixion was based on the accusation that he was against Caesar. Now, that didn't always stick, and the persecutions didn't always stick. When we get to the early 4th century, the emperor at the time was Diocletian. Diocletian has received really a bad name, but actually he was a brilliant administrator. He divided the empire into 4 parts. It's called the Tetrarchy, East and West, because by this time the empire was so extensive. It reached all the way up to Britain and all the way in the east to India, basically. All of North Africa. It was huge. And he said, administratively, this is a real problem to administer. So I'm going to split it in half. Western and Eastern. Each part will be ruled by an Augustus. And each Augustus will have like a vice Augustus who will be called a Caesar. And the idea was that the Caesar then would become the new Augustus once the Augustus went about. Now, Diocletian also instigated a number of other administrative reforms, including the further administrative division of the empire into what he referred to as dioceses, individual administrative structures that would be overseen by an overseer. In Latin, this is before Christianity, the term episcopus was the term for overseer. So a diocese would be led by an episcopus. And in English, the term episcopus is translated as bishop. And this is a pre-Christian term. But what came about was that the Christianity ended up adopting Roman administrative structures. So we end up having Christian bishops being in charge of dioceses. Now, Diocletian also said, but we have to get rid of the Christians because the Christians, once and for all, they've been a thorn in our side all along. He institutes the Great Persecution in 303 CE, the Common Era, and it goes until 305. The problem was Christianity had grown too much by that time. It's been estimated that it may have been as much as 10% of the population of the Roman Empire had become Christian by that time. You can't just get rid of all of that. His attempts to do so failed. He realized that. And so in 305, he abdicated. And that led to this power struggle. And to make a long story short, the individual that came to power eventually was an individual named Constantine. And Constantine then reunited the entire Roman Empire under his rule. Important thing. Part of his final victory, Constantine's, to establish himself as the sole emperor, was a battle known as the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. And on the eve of the battle, tradition has it, we can't say as historians if this really happened or not. Tradition has it that Constantine had a vision. He saw in the sky, in different versions, either a Chi-Rho, the Greek, first two Greek letters of the name Christus, or Christos in Greek. It's like the PX. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it, or the cross. Two different versions, and the Chi-Rho looks kind of like a cross anyway. So, and the vision, he saw this image in the sky, and he heard this voice: "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign, conquer. So Constantine had his troops paint the sign on their shields. Next morning went into battle and was victorious. He establishes himself as the official leader of Rome, and he attributed his success to that vision, to Christianity, the Christian symbol. And in 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, which proclaimed Christianity a legal religion. So before then, Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire. It was a crime against the state to be Christian, because there was a state religion. Roman religion in general was very loose and very open. So you could almost believe whatever you wanted as long as you performed the required rituals, also for the emperor, and adhered to within the general umbrella of Roman religion. The Christians weren't willing to do that, so they were actually criminals against the state. Once Constantine proclaims Christianity as legal, then they're no longer criminal. They can no longer be persecuted. And Constantine starts to favor Christians. And then in 325, he calls together a council, the Council of Nicaea, because he says, we need to set some doctrine here. What is it really that Christians actually believe? And at the Council of Nicaea, they do a number of things. They establish what became known as the Nicene Creed. And the creed is just the English version of the Latin word credo, I believe. And so the Nicene Creed was a statement of the basic beliefs of Christianity. It is still the foundational creedal statement for most of the Christian denominations. It also then established the books of the canon. What books would be part of the Bible? Because there were other books that were non-canonical, as it's called, that were circulating, Christian writings. But this was a way to say, these are the books that will be authoritative, that will be accepted as divine revelation. Other Christian writings can be read for edification, but are not part of Scripture. And all theological determinations have to be based on Scripture. Now, they also condemned Arianism. Arianism was an early Christological heresy that claimed that Jesus of Nazareth was adopted as the Son of God. Oh, where does that come from? Well, we've seen that before. Julius Caesar. That made a lot of sense to a lot of people. Jesus became divine. He was born a human being, but had a special relationship to God, and then God adopted Jesus as God's Son. That was condemned at Nicaea. Now, once a doctrine or a position is condemned, it then becomes a heresy. And the term heresy is a Greek term. Originally it just meant the type of Greek philosophy you chose to follow, your hieresis, what was your school of philosophy that you followed, your choice. But with Christianity, it became the basis for distinguishing correct doctrine, right doctrine, true doctrine, or orthodoxy, correct teaching, and then false teaching, heresy. That became the distinction. But just because a doctrine is proclaimed as heretical doesn't mean it went away. It doesn't mean that then the state went after and persecuted all quote unquote heretics. Not at all. And we'll see this shortly when many of the Germanic tribes were Christian, they were Arian Christians. But it did mean that theoretically, if you were not part of the Orthodox, did not adhere to the Orthodox positions, you were a criminal against the state. This was an imperial council. Yes, all the bishops were there and the theologians and the abbots. We'll talk about monasticism later. But it was still led by the emperor and it had imperial authority. And this was an imperial decree. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the later Middle Ages and even into the early modern period, the quote-unquote church never executed a single heretic. The state did. And that is a distinction that is really a false distinction, which I'll be talking about a lot later on, because there was no really distinction between church and state. They're one and the same. There was a huge distinction between the laity and the clergy, the ordained and the lay. I'll be talking about that shortly as well, because that is the major distinction and points of conflict and the issue of power. But I'll get there. Anyway, so Constantine legalizes Christianity. Then another thing that Constantine ended up doing was he moved the capital of Rome from Rome to Constantinople, his own city. This is in the east. Today is Istanbul. It's in Turkey. And just think about that for a second. So all of a sudden, the capital of the Roman Empire was no longer in Rome. It was in Constantinople. Constantinople was predominantly a Greek-speaking city. At the time, with any intellectual, any educated individual within the empire was bilingual thoroughly in Latin and in Greek, or their local dialect or local language as well. But we begin to see a split between the Latin West and the Greek East. And that really begins with Constantine's moving the capital in 330 CE to Constantinople. When Constantine dies, with one exception, the emperors were all Christians. At the end of the 4th century, 391, the emperor was Theodosius. Theodosius then proclaimed Christianity to be the only legal religion of Rome. All of a sudden, it was a crime against the state not to be Christian. That was a huge development. And just think about this. In the span of one long lifetime, Christianity went from being an illegal religion that was trying to be wiped out by the emperor to being proclaimed the only legal religion. And this has been interpreted as what's called Christian triumphalism, and saying, oh, this is obviously based on divine will. Because, as I said, this myth of Rome as this divinely sanctioned eternal empire became adopted by Christians once the Roman Empire became Christian as their own myth. That Christianity, that Christian Rome would become this divinely sanctioned empire without end. Now, there are other ways of understanding it, and scholars have shown that. Politically, Theodosius was almost just recognizing that the population, by this time, Christianity had probably grown to over 50% of the population, that he had the support for it politically. And scholars who have studied religious movements have shown that the growth of Christianity during the 4th century, if it just continued on a basic trajectory of 4% growth per year, arithmetic progression, that would lead to this huge increase in the percentage of the population that became Christian. So there's no need to appeal to divine causation. And as historians, as they argued, we can't appeal to divine causation for historical developments and phenomena. The whole point behind this, though, is that once Theodosius proclaims Christianity the only legal religion of the Roman Empire, it is a crime against the state not to be Christian. Now there's tensions because there's a lot of opposition, and that especially was tensions when in 410 Rome was sacked by Alaric the Goth, who was actually a Roman general, and that led to Augustine of Hippo writing his great work, The City of God, which I'm not going to go into here and now. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next lecture, I think. So now we have this conflict and this attempt to say, okay, how do we deal with this new entity? And what happens thereafter? Well, there's the so-called fall of Rome. But I already said, I think, last lecture, there's no such thing as the fall of Rome. It's a historiographical construct by Edward Gibbon. But what did happen was that Roman administrative authority in the West receded during the course of the 4th on into the 5th century. And in 476, the Germanic leader, Odoacer, wrote to the emperor in the East. He said, hey, you know what? The emperor here in the West, this Romulus Augustulus, the little Romulus, is worthless. Tell you what, with your support, I will depose him and I will rule the West for you. Now, the Eastern emperor, the Augustus in Constantinople, said, that sounds like a great idea. Increases my authority and power. So that's what Odoacer did. He deposed Romulus Augustulus and proclaimed himself leader of the West. It happens again under Theodoric a little bit later. But that is what is referred to as the fall of Rome. And yet, the sources don't ever talk about the fall of Rome. For Odoacer, the emperor was still in the East, very much so. And when another Germanic tribe, the Franks, rose to power in the course of the 5th century too, there in the north, Clovis unified the Franks and proclaimed himself king of the Franks, and Clovis converted to Orthodox Roman Christianity, not Arians. Many of the Germanic tribes, that's what we have to realize, that these so-called barbarian invasions, they weren't barbarians, they were Germanic tribes. That's a whole issue. In my medieval course, I spent a lot of time talking about the concept of barbarians. And it's fascinating because it's a term always that is outside, that is used for others. It goes back to the Greeks. And originally, the Greeks referred to the barbarians as those people who did not speak Greek, who sounded like they were saying bar, because they did not speak Greek. Then it became those who did not speak Latin. And then it became those who were not Christian. But some of the Germanic groups, not all of them, but some of the Germanic tribes that were there in the north were Christian, but they were Arian Christians. But Clovis converts to Orthodox Roman Christianity. The emperor in the East sends Clovis the imperial purple regalia as saying, you are my guy now in the West. And Clovis converts in like 501 or something like that. I forget. He dies in 511. Great stories about Clovis and the Franks, because the Franks were going to be essential for the rest of the development of medieval Christendom, which we're still not really there yet. Now, sorry, this is taking too much time, but I can't refrain myself really too much. So I'll try to move along. Clovis established a dynasty ruling the Franks, as the king of the Franks, known as the Merovingians. As time went along, the Merovingian kings got to be, they became known as the Do-Nothing Kings. In 711, Charles Martel became the mayor of the palace. And that was a new position, basically so that the Merovingian kings didn't have to do much at all. And the mayor of the palace, it was called, kind of like the prime minister, was really the governing the country, or the rule. This was very much a personal rule, and fought and saved the West, because at this time Islam had arisen and had made incursions all through North Africa, into Spain, and Charles Martel led Frankish forces at the Battle of Tours to defeat Islamic forces to stop the further incursion of Islam into the western part of the empire, and the king of the Franks. Finally, his son Pepin wrote to the Pope in 551, the Pope, Bishop of Rome, and said, "Look, I have a question for you, Pope. Who should be king? He with the power, or he with the title?" No, that's what I'm paraphrasing, but he did write that. We have those documents. It was like, P.S. I hear you're having problems with the Lombards. The Lombards were another Germanic group who were not Christians, and they were in northern Italy. We still refer to northern Italy as Lombardy, or a lot of it. The Pope there in Rome was a problem. So the Pope writes back to Pepin and says, "Dear Pepin, I got your letter. Thank you very much. I've thought about this, and it's my view that he should be king who has the power. Love the Pope. P.S. Yes, I am having a lot of problems with the Lombards. Can you help?" On that basis, papal support, Pepin deposes the last Merovingian king, cuts off his hair. He was also known as a long-haired king, based on Samson, the image of Samson, and sends him to a monastery. And then he leads an army into over the Alps into Italy to help provide a buffer zone for the Pope, and establishes the Pope as the ruler of central Italy. He became known as the Papal States, so that the Bishop of Rome became the actual ruler of central Italy, with the support of the Franks as the military arm thereof. This became known as the Franco-Papal Alliance. This Franco-Papal Alliance was to have significant impact from this point on, because Pepin's son, when Pepin dies in 768, took over, and his name was Charles. And Charles was truly a great leader. He became known as Charles the Great, or in French, Charlemagne. And Charlemagne ruled a more extensive empire than had anyone since Roman authority in the West had been flourishing. Now, Charlemagne, too, continued this Franco-Papal alliance. So when the Pope was still having problems with the Lombards, and when he beseeches Charlemagne to help save the papacy from the Lombards, Charlemagne leads forces back into northern Italy, defeats the Lombards once and for all, and on Christmas Day 800, the Pope crowns Charlemagne Roman Emperor. Point being here, not Holy Roman Emperor. That may even be what your textbook says, but that is not correct. He was crowned Roman Emperor. A continuation. This was also based on the position of the Pope feeling that the emperor in the East had fallen into heresy. Now, that's a contradiction in terms. I'm not going to go into all the details over iconoclasm. But you can't have a Christian emperor who's a heretic. It's a contradiction in terms. So a heretical emperor is the same as no emperor. There's an imperial vacancy. So the Pope said it relies then on me to crown the new emperor. So he crowns Charlemagne, the emperor of Rome. This is the same Roman Empire established by Augustus, this divinely sanctioned eternal empire, even though in reality it was much less. Charlemagne wasn't all that thrilled about it, but he accepted the title. And at Charlemagne's court, he said, we need to really work on things. He brought about what became known as the Carolingian Renaissance, whereby he brought the best scholars of the day to his court in Aachen. He had them write a whole series of new textbooks on the liberal arts and things. And he had them standardize the biblical text, and to standardize the handwriting, because everything was produced by hand, and handwriting was so all over the place. It became known as Carolingian minuscule. It was based on Roman half-uncial. But this way we could really understand and read what the common script was for the empire. from this point on, it became known as the Carolingian Empire and the Charlemagne's Empire. It's still very much a personal empire. And when Charlemagne dies in 814, the empire goes to his son Louis. And Louis was called Louis the Pious. Louis was not all that great. He was not as great as his father Charlemagne. And he had 3 surviving sons. And these 3 surviving sons started arguing over who was going to inherit from their father Louis, the German. The 3 surviving sons were named Charles, Louis, and Lothar. They argued back and forth, and they fought back and forth, and sometimes they even allied with their father Louis against the other 2. It was a horrible mess, especially after Louis dies, until they finally come to a solution in 843 and sign a treaty, the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divides the empire. And Charles, who became known as Charles the Bald, received the western part of the Frankish Empire. Louis, known as Louis the German, received the eastern part of the Frankish Empire, and Lothar received the central part and the title Emperor. So that Charles the Bald was king of the Western Empire, Frankish Empire. Louis the German was king of the Eastern Frankish Empire. And Lothar was the emperor. This is important because this region of Lothar was between the regions and territories of Charles and of Louis. What do we know about that region? France and Germany were fighting over that region ever since, including all the way into World War I and World War II, because the Lothar's region was known as Lotharingia, or the Alsace-Lorraine. It all goes back to 843. But what is important here is this concept of the emperor and the empire. Now, the Carolingian line eventually dies off. It is reestablished, the empire, with the Saxon dynasty, the Saxon kings, Otto I in 962. And here we have the beginnings of officially the Holy Roman Empire. Otto I is crowned the Holy Roman Emperor, whereas Charlemagne was crowned the Roman Emperor, as was then Louis the Pious, his son, and Lothar. So that's the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. And conceptually, it is important because now it is really fused together. That fusion of a Roman Empire that was Christian and holy had already kind of been there with Charlemagne, especially when we see at Charlemagne's court the beginning use of the term Populus Christianus, the Christian people, and the Christian empire, Imperium Christianum. This concept of the Christian empire, which is different from the empire becoming Christian. Just think about that for a bit. Became established with Charlemagne and then fully developed then when we get to the Holy Roman Empire with Otto I. That's what this is all about. And the myth of Christendom is the myth of this geopolitical entity that is a Christian empire that was a divinely sanctioned empire for eternity. And yet by Otto's time, even by after the Treaty of Verdun, if you ask the King of France, or what was becoming the King of France, the Kingdom of the Franks, what's the relationship to the emperor? Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm underneath the emperor, but not really. Same way with, quote unquote, Germany. But of course, Germany was decentralized. There was no such political entity as Germany until 1871, far beyond this course, because that was it became part of the empire. And the empire was a republic. Well, not really a republic, but it was a confederation. I'll be talking more about that shortly. But those are some of the structures. And this political organization is vital to understand what's going to be happening in terms of the Reformation, because we have the emperor, we have the King of France, we have the King of England, we have the King of Spain eventually after 1492. And politically, there are issues going on, and the empire is decentralized, consisting of numerous kingdoms and principalities and margraves, and so already in 354, there was established the Golden Bull to determine who could elect the emperor, because after a while, the emperor became not a hereditary office, but an elected office. And the major Germanic princes would elect the emperor, but there was always fighting about who had a vote. And so the Emperor Charles IV in 354 issued and proclaimed the Golden Bull to set the number of electors at 7. So there'd be 7 electors. I have them up there for you on the next slide. Actually, I've skipped way ahead. But on the slide where I get to the emperor, that's way down the line a little bit. Which I'll have to come back to that. But it is there. Yes, this is the slide on the emperor, but which I'll come back to. We have the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, Cologne, and then we have the lay princes of Margrave of Brandenburg, the Duke of Saxony, the Count Palatine, and the King of Bohemia. So I've skipped ahead to that, but I'll come back to that because we still have to get to other issues here. And the point is this myth of Christendom as this entity underneath the emperor, which is elected. Now, the Pope was also elected by the College of Cardinals. I'll come back to that when I get there, but I just want to point out that the two most senior, powerful offices within Christendom, the emperor and the Pope, were both elected offices. And it's the tension between these two. One is a lay office, the emperor. The other is an ordained office, the papacy, the clergy. Clergy and laity. That's the conflict, not church and state, because both of them viewed it all as one thing. Conflicts were who was there. Now, I've gotten ahead of myself. And I know I'm kind of running behind, but I'll try to go through this more quickly. Some of the other basic structures to understand of Christendom are two. The first is called manorialism, and the other is feudalism. Manorialism was the basic, fundamental social and economic system of Christendom. It's not the same as feudalism, but it seems very similar. There would be a lord of the manor, and the lord of the manor would be responsible for the manor. And the manor was a territory that was cleared for agricultural production. It doesn't have to be the same as a castle. You don't have to have a knight leading a manor, but often knights would lead a manor. So you'd have a manor, you'd have the lord of the manor, you'd have the village, and the peasants working for the lord. This was a system of reciprocal rights and obligations. The rights of the peasants were to farm, to hunt, to fish, and to collect firewood. The rights of the lords was to receive taxes from the production of the manor. The responsibilities of the peasants were to work on the lord's domain, which was the part of the manor that the lord kept for himself, and to pay taxes in kind. And the responsibilities of the Lord were to protect the manor and its inhabitants, to provide for the spiritual and physical well-being of the manor. That is simply what I have up there on the slide, but that is also important because these reciprocal rights and privileges, we'll see in the later Middle Ages, started being infringed upon, which caused conflicts. We have peasant revolts. And when we get there, we'll see that there was never a peasant revolt that claimed we don't want to be peasants anymore. They're always saying we're happy to be peasants, just give us our traditional rights as peasants. But that structure was the basis for the economic production. A knight was defined as a mounted warrior. I've often made the analogy as like a tank unit. It was a whole unit of fighting. That was a knight, because you have the knight in full armor on his war horse in armor. You have the squires that made that all possible, putting it all together. Very effective fighting force. And a knight received a fief, and this brings us from manorialism to feudalism. And feudalism was the um, political and cultural system of Christendom. And a fief was the amount of land needed to support one knight. But it also could be used in a more general term. That was a more technical definition of a fief, of any grant of land. So we have the lord and then the vassals. And the lord, the top lord, is the king or the emperor. Everyone underneath is a vassal. We'll see there's conflicts between kings and the emperor at times. So there wasn't quite technically a lord-vassal relationship, but theoretically, at least in the emperor's eyes, there was. And we'll see some of those conflicts. There was a ritualized ceremony to receive this grant of land. It's called homage, whereby the vassal would become the man of the lord. That too was based on the military, and so when a lord called up his vassals, that was the vassals were required to go fight for and with the lord. The issue is there's something called subinfeudation. A vassal, one of the large vassals, not physically large, but the large grants of land, far more than to support one knight, would also become lords of other vassals, called subinfeudation. And so you'd have the king or the emperor, and you'd have a series of major vassals. And underneath these vassals, they'd have their vassals, and these vassals of the king or the emperor would be then the lords of their vassals, and all that would go all the way down. And at times, though, when we get far enough down the pyramid, so to speak, there can be conflicts between the vassals and the lords, because a vassal down the hierarchy could then subinfeudate his land even further to somebody who actually owed allegiance to another lord. So when there was those kinds of issues, there's tensions and cracks within the feudal system itself. But that is the basic structure of the feudal position, the feudal, what called feudal Europe, in terms of the political and cultural system of Christendom. And this is the whole issue of chivalry. We'll get more into that a little bit later, but this is important to understand as well. Now, there are inherent structure problems within the structure of feudalism, manorialism. And one of those is that in the 12th century, or by the 12th century or so, the feudal relationships became standardized in legal codes. These are more theoretical codes of the way things should be, just like legal codes are today. Law reflects the prescriptions of society more than the actual practice. And if you deny that, just think about how many of us drive 55 miles an hour on 465. That's the law. But if we extrapolate from the law to the practice, we won't understand what really driving on 465 is like. Same thing here. So there are tensions within that between the theoretical structure and then the practicalities. The theoretical structure was problematic too because it divided everybody into three orders. The term ordo is a very important word in medieval Latin. Ordo, ordinus. It refers to many different things. Here, we can almost think of these as classes of people. Now, that term technically is a 19th century term, but in a more general sense, three types of people, three orders. Those who fought, the nobility, those who prayed, the clergy, and those who worked, the peasants. But beginning around the year 1000, there developed other peoples who didn't really fit into that threefold structure very well, namely merchants and artisans in the cities. Beginning around the year 1000, there was a huge population boom. Cities are being established all over the place. And we have a development too called the communes, the emergence of communes. They're the incorporated cities or the free imperial cities. These are cities that got together and they petitioned their overlord, the king, to say, we're happy to pay you feudal dues, but we want to be directly under your authority rather than under the authority of our direct overlord. And we want to do so as a group, as a whole, not simply as a group of individuals or single individuals, but as a whole. So this city will be one of your cities. The king would issue a charter recognizing the rights of that city, taking those cities outside of the feudal structure. Now, the princes and the lords, the direct overlords of the cities, couldn't really complain because the king was doing this or the emperor was doing this. In the empire, these were called free imperial cities. In France, they were called communes. They didn't really develop much in England. But these were cities that were outside the feudal structure of the hierarchy, but they were directly under the authority of the king or the emperor, and on we go. This is going to be important later on because the Reformation spread very quickly among the imperial free cities. But this is what the origins was of these communes, and also it is the origins basically of corporate law, because this is really a corporate way of thinking. What is a corporation legally? It is a legal person, and that's what these communes or imperial free cities became. Legal entities, a legal person as a whole, as a collective. Again, this is going to be very important for what happens later on. Now, I'm really running out of time here. But this then brings me back to the overall concept of then, if Christendom is this geopolitical entity, who then really ruled it? Was it the emperor or was it the pope? And here we get to the ecclesiastical and lay hierarchies. And there's conflicts. Here I have on the next slide the ecclesiastical and lay hierarchy. You can see this on both sides. For both, God is seen as the head. The head of everything is God. Underneath, on the ecclesiastical side, God is the Pope, the archbishops, bishops, priests, and people. On the lay hierarchy, we have God, the emperor, kings, dukes, counts, margraves, knights, and the people. So the people are the same. So there is a parallel within these two hierarchies, and there is conflicts between the two. And it is never all that clear. If you're dealing with a temporal lord or a spiritual lord, because the bishops were both, just as the Pope was both with the establishment of the Papal States back within the Franco-Papal Alliance. So it becomes very tenuous over what is the relationship between the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy. What is the source of the power? This was a tension that goes all the way back to, actually in some ways, to Constantine, and certainly the arguments from both sides went all the way back to Constantine. We'll see more of that in the next lecture, how that all played itself out. But it was always going on there because the kings and the emperors felt that the clergy worked for them. For them, this is the church, so to speak, referring to the clergy, was a state church, because the church was part of their ownership. This goes back to the manors, and something I didn't address on the slide of the manors, the proprietary church. If I'm lord of a manor, I also need to provide for the spiritual well-being of my people, so that I provide for the church. I select the priests. It's very local. That model was there for the entire lay hierarchy. So if I am king or emperor, I'm responsible for the religious, spiritual well-being of my people. I'm the one to appoint bishops because they need to be loyal to me, after all. It's a state church. On the ecclesiastical side, it's like, I'm the Pope. No, the emperor works for me. We don't have a state church. We have a church state, with church here referred to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The distinction between church and state is a false distinction. It's a modern distinction, and at the time, throughout the Middle Ages, on through the Reformation, no one would have understood if we said what was the conflict between church and state. That wouldn't make any sense to them, because they're one and the same. What did make sense to them was the conflict between ecclesiastical power and lay power. And the church and state conflict is only when we start equating the term church with the ecclesiastical hierarchy and state with the lay hierarchy. If we do that, then we could see the conflict. But both sides define the church the same way as the communion of all believers. That's what is the state. A Christian state is the communion of all believers. I'll be talking a lot more about that next lecture. So that's the source of this tension that we need to understand and grasp to understand what was going on when we get to the 16th century. And this brings me back to the emperor, which I've already mentioned and talked about and dealt with in terms of the concept of the emperor, because that's going to be very important for our discussions as we get into the 16th century. And it all was about who ruled Christendom. And if the both sides took their responsibilities seriously, which they did, not everyone did, but they did. The leaders, the princes, are responsible for their people and will have to answer to God for that. But so are the priests and so are the bishops. Both were responsible to God. That's serious if you take your responsibilities seriously enough. You can also see the conflict, because if I'm a prince and I feel that I am going to have to answer to God for the spiritual well-being of my people and my territory, I want to make sure that they are provided the best pastoral care and best theological teaching and instruction and religious lives that they possibly can be. But if I'm the bishop, I feel the same way, because I'm going to have to answer to God for that. And if we have differing ideas of what that entails, there's going to be conflicts. That is the best model. Now, again, not everyone took their responsibilities seriously. Were there abuses? Oh, yes, on both sides, without question. That's the theory that's there, and it's important. And then we come into the issue that made all this work together, and that is the sacramental system. Because it was all based on the different hierarchies